Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to week 3 of Technical Writing with Mr. Measle. I hope everybody's excited because we're about to get started. Okay, so this week we're going to be talking about audience, purpose, and document design. And so what I want you to go ahead and do in terms of readings, and this is what I'm going to be going over today, just focus on chapters 4, 6, and 7. I know that some of you are submitting your article summary and analyses to the discussion boards this week. I want you to go ahead and do that. And if any of you get a chance to go ahead and move on to those scholarly articles this week by Chandler and Johnson, that'd be great. But technically, you don't really need them to get started on your document design draft. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about the concepts in chapters 4 and then 6 and 7. And then after that, I'm going to go ahead and talk to you about the document design assignment. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's move on over here to Markel chapter 4. Okay, so chapter 4, as it says, is about audience and purpose. So audience and purpose, as I discussed before, are a couple of elements of the rhetorical situation. And often, knowing your purpose is going to tell you who your audience should be. Knowing your audience is going to tell you what your purpose should be. So I'm going to go over this concept of audience for a moment and different elements of it, and then we'll talk about the rhetorical situation in total. We've already talked about purposes. The purpose to inform, the purpose to convince, and the purpose to persuade. There's also the purpose to entertain, which really isn't something that very often is going to show up in technical writing. Just as a short review on those. Now let's go ahead and talk about audience. So anytime that you are in a rhetorical situation, anytime that you are conveying some kind of information, regardless of whether you're persuading someone, you have an audience. Even if you are writing out a journal, you're writing to an audience of yourself, and you are the audience. So in order to make your piece of writing as effective and efficient as possible, you need to learn what you can about your audience, and then you need to adapt to your audience. So what kinds of things can you learn about your audience? There are several different variables that you're going to run into with every audience. So depending on what culture your audience lives in, right? They're probably going to primarily use one particular language. They're going to be within a particular age group. They're going to have a certain degree of digital exposure. So some people probably are able to use the internet more frequently than others, or some people may not have access to the internet at all. You're going to have people who have different interests, and you want to try to appeal to those interests. So if you have people who are really excited about coding, those people are probably going to be much better audience members for a video about coding than people who aren't interested in coding at all. And then there are other kinds of cultural identifications that people have, and these range from religion to, as I said earlier, language to even race and gender. So you want to be as sensitive to these as you can. You want to use these elements that you know about the audience in order to make your message more appealing to them. So an obvious example of how you would do this is to speak in the language that you know your audience speaks. So you wouldn't deliver a message in English to an audience of people who only speak Italian. They wouldn't understand what you were saying. But a less obvious way to do this would be to approach maybe an older age group. So if you have people who are in the late adult range, right, maybe from the age of 60 on up, you're probably going to want to speak a little bit slower. You're probably going to want to be a little bit more conservative with your language. You might even want to convey your message in such a way that your audience doesn't have to have a lot of computer knowledge in order to access it and in order to access it and read it and follow it. And finally, you might even want to use things like larger print or a louder volume, because these are more accessible to an older audience, and these are needs that they have that a younger audience probably isn't going to need. And I want you to notice that you are definitely in these situations assuming things about your audience. However, the audience is always imagined. even when you're in the same room with the person that you're speaking with, you don't know everything about that person. And you're not sitting there asking them about themselves the whole time. And even though you do know some things about that person, even what you feel like you know could be wrong. It's all this, you're dealing completely with a mental construct of your audience. And they can even correct you about that as you're talking to them. And you have to be really careful about not only making sure that you are making sure that you're appealing well to this mental construct, but also being as accurate with that mental construct as you can, because you in no way in any situation want to be offensive to your audience, because you could easily drive them away, or if you assume that they know less than they do, you can drive them away. Or if, like I said earlier, you use a language that they don't know how to speak, you can drive them away. There are a number of ways that you can upset your audience, even certainly unintentionally. Although sometimes people do it unintentionally, which is, I don't know why you would want to do that, because nobody's going to keep reading your document, but people do. Another thing that you want to think about with your audience, and we've already talked about this before, is what level of knowledge do they have concerning the topic that you're talking about? And specifically, like, if you are giving them a task and you're giving them instructions as to how to accomplish that task, how much do they know about that particular task as opposed to maybe the topic in which it sits? So there's a context, right? So somebody may know a lot about engineering, but they may not know how to design a particular item. So somebody may know a lot about coding, but they don't know how to create a particular algorithm, or they don't know how to create a particular program. You're going to have people who, and this is just an easy way to categorize it, you're going to have people who have a beginner's level of knowledge, an intermediate level of knowledge, and an expert level of knowledge. So if somebody has an expert level of knowledge, you're not going to come in and tell them all the basics about how to do something. So if you're showing them how to do something, for example, in Microsoft Word, you're not going to tell them where all the buttons are on Microsoft Word in the toolbar, because they probably already know this. You're not going to tell them that they need to, like when they save a file, go click on File and then go down to Save As. You really don't need to tell them this, and it's actually a little bit annoying, if not a lot annoying, to the audience, because they find that you're underestimating them. This is more appropriate with with a person who has intermediate knowledge, but even then, you really don't need to explain the basics. When you're explaining the basics, in most situations, you need to be talking to a beginner audience with that kind of attitude. So if you're talking to an expert audience, you don't need to go into as much basic detail or explain what tools are or anything like that. You may still go into a high level of detail with the expert, but it's the kind of detail that only the expert can follow generally. And you're going to often be speaking to them with a particular jargon that fits within that niche area that you're talking to them about, as opposed to using a simpler diction with an intermediate level audience or a beginner level audience. Okay, so I've already talked to you about purpose. You have sometimes your purpose is to inform. When you're just giving someone information, when you are convincing, you go beyond informing to prove that that information is true with some kind of evidence. And if you are persuading or motivating, you are going beyond convincing in order to say, okay, so now that you know that this thing that I've told you is true based on the evidence, I want you to take a particular action. If you want to see some more about techniques for learning about your audience, just go over here to this section that starts on page 59. And there's also some good stuff about multicultural communication on 63, or starting on 63. So let's go ahead and talk about the rhetorical situation, because I want you to get a better understanding of what I meant earlier when I said that if you know some elements of the rhetorical situation, like the audience, then you can figure out what other elements of the rhetorical situation should be, or how they should manifest, how you should model your piece of writing, how you should shape your piece of writing. So the elements of the rhetorical situation that we're going to talk about are medium, genre, audience, author, message, purpose, tone, arrangement, and design. So I've sent each of you a message telling you the rhetorical elements that you need to discuss when you go over your when you perform your scholarly article summary and analysis. And these are all of the same elements, except for I've added arrangement in here, and I'll talk about that when I talk about design, because there's kind of a thin line between these, but they're also very similar. So what is medium? Medium literally refers to what the document is made of. And so I remember even when I was first teaching, I was like, how do you even qualify this? Because there are obviously different ways to break this up into categories. You could have 6 different categories. You could have 2 different categories. Probably not 2. You could have a lot of different categories. You could have a small number of categories, depending on just how much you want to parse this concept, right? So when I first started teaching this, I actually just went to my teaching director and I said, look, how do you break this down for your students? Because when I talk to them about medium, right, they know exactly what medium is, but then when they would try to talk about what a medium was, they didn't know what kind of answer they didn't know what kind of answer that we as instructors might be looking for. So let me give you a few categories when you're thinking about medium. So with medium, let's say you could have something that's either print or sound or electronic. So something that's in print is something that you can hold in your hand, right? Like a book or a pamphlet or a brochure. Something that sound might be, for example, a podcast or just a conversation or even a phone call or a recorded interview. And I understand that in some of these situations, it does involve an electronic aspect. However, this is something that you can talk about when you're describing the medium. So you don't have to, like, if you were performing like a professional rhetorical analysis in an article, right? You wouldn't have to break it down to specifically these categories because that's the only way to talk about it. No, what you have to do is demonstrate that you understand what it is that you are looking at. And let me give you another example of where it can get complicated. So let's talk about the medium of something that's electronic. Video often has sound in it, but let's think about scholarly articles that are presented that come up both in print and get published online. So I share a lot of digital PDFs with you. Primarily for you, these are electronic texts. That doesn't mean that they don't also exist in print. You have an electronic copy of the text. If you were to cite that copy that you have, you would need to cite it as an electronic copy, and then you would need to provide the web address for it. However, when you're talking about it, when you're analyzing it, you can say, this is an electronic text that comes from this journal, which is also in print. And that's totally okay. And it gives your description of the document some nuance. And it makes it a little deeper. It makes it a little bit more relatable. And your audience can picture what it is that you're talking about that much better. Okay. So just to clarify, electronic refers to, like, for example, anything that's on the web. It also refers to video. It pretty much refers to anything that runs electronically. Right, but certainly any kind of communication that you do in the digital space falls under electronic, and that includes all of your social media. It includes all of your emails. It includes all of the websites that you go to, and these digital documents that I send you. So, what is genre? Genre, it often gets mixed up with medium, and you can say that different media are different kinds of communication, but the genre is what type of document are you looking at? So you have large categories like scholarly articles, proposals, websites, and each of these are genres. However, you can say more about the genre than that, right? And say enough so that your audience knows what you're talking about. So if you're going to talk about a website, what kind of website is it? Is it a business website? Is it a website that's there for entertainment? Is it a website for social media? Is it a blog? Each of these different kinds of websites has a particular rhythm that it follows, so that when people come to it, they're able to recognize it easily because it meets certain genre conventions. A blog looks like a blog. An article looks like an article. You're establishing both what the document is, but also you're establishing your ethos because you're able to pick up on those rhythms and communicate them to your audience. Okay, so audience. We've already talked about what different kinds of audiences there are. Author is the person who composes the message. The message is essentially an easy way to think about this is the thesis of whatever the document is. It has one particular main idea that it's trying to get across. Often you can find this in the headline. Often you can find this in a short description under the headline. You can find it in maybe a call to action and a memo. And so the message is a tool that you can weigh the rest of the document against to determine whether or not you feel like it met its purpose. So, for example, if you have a document with the purpose to inform, and it wants to inform you that there are 1,000 different kinds of hardwood that you can use in your home, and then it lists all of those different kinds of hardwood for flooring, and then you turn around and you say, did the author inform me of what they said they would inform me of? Did this message end up manifesting in the document? And then if you find that it did, because those 1,000 kinds of hardwood are there, then you have to say, well, yes, it did, right? You can find some problems in it that could maybe hurt the author's ethos. Maybe they end up using like poor citation, right? If they go beyond informing to try and convince you. Maybe they have lots of mechanical errors in their language that make you think that they didn't spend a lot of time with this document. They didn't edit it. Maybe they're not very credible. Maybe they don't have any kind of credentials in the area of hardwood flooring. And this is one way in which you determine whether or not the document is even effective. So tone refers to the attitude that you're conveying in a document. So this often gets mixed with voice, although voice is more about how credible you sound. It's about how you're conveying your credentials. It's about your authority on the subject. Whereas, and that does involve diction, but diction is also involved in tone. So you could sound angry, you could sound sad, you could sound funny, you could sound happy. But the thing that you want to pay probably the most attention to when you're looking at technical writing documents is whether it sounds formal or informal. Because most of the time with a technical writing document, if not all of the time, you're going to want to be formal. There are some situations, like I talked about before, with like microblogs, for example, or like some kind of creating web content representing an organization online, when that organization has a certain persona and you want to fit into that persona and continue that persona, and sometimes you can be informal within within that box. So let's go ahead and talk about content. Content is literally what is there in the document. Right, so you have particular shapes, you have particular images, you have text. You literally have the words that are there on the page, right? And then you have ideas as well. So when we're talking about ideas, I link ideas, the ideas and the content with arrangement. Right? So where do these ideas go and how do they flow in the document? Does the author jump around from one idea to the next with no linking language? Is it impossible to follow because of that? Or does the author make lots of logical arguments that carry you from one idea to the next and make the document flow well? And you want to think of this in terms of something even as simple as like introduction, right? Maybe two or three sections for main themes, and then a conclusion. The other way that I like to think about what's done with content The other way I like to think about what's done with content is this notion of design. So we've talked about arrangement, and arrangement is where the ideas go and how they fit together. But design is how is the document visually laid out? How is the visual space used? What is the balance between white space and used space? Where are the headlines, and how can you tell that they're headlines? Is there continuity between each of the headlines? What's the color scheme, and what's the distribution within that color scheme? So let me give you an example of how to think about arrangement. Just going to open up this article, Introduction to Genre Theory. Okay. So not only do you want to be thinking about the ideas and how they're arranged, but you also want to think about literally how prose text gets arranged, because this informs how you absorb the ideas. We can tell that this is an article, right? It's got, due to the design, right? It's got its title up here. It's got the author underneath the title. This is using proximity to show you that this author is associated with this title, and given that we've seen a lot of different authored documents, and specifically in this case a lot of different scholarly articles, we know that's probably the author of this article. And here we have this heading, we have the number 1 next to it, showing us that this is the first thing we need to look at. And those are all design principles. But if you want to think about arrangement here, look at the way this text is arranged. All right? It's very predictable. It's a system that we're very, very used to, right? It's broken up into paragraphs. And these paragraphs are broken up across the page into 2 different columns. And this is not uncommon for an article. It's probably just the way that this journal likes to publish their articles. But this paragraphing, right? This is very, very common to prose. This is how we've come to recognize prose when we read it. We have these ideas here that are chunked, not only to divide the text where one idea stops and the author moves into the next one, but also so that we don't get kind of scared when we look at it. Because if you look at a piece of text that's just a huge block all the way across the page, it makes your brain say, I don't like the way that this is arranged. I don't like the way it's set up. I don't want to read this. It's daunting. Because we have to take our information in chunks. So when we see it chunked up on the page before we even start reading it, our brain says, okay, so I'm going to read that chunk, I'm going to read that chunk, I'm going to read that chunk. And they all seem a lot more manageable than they would if they were all just shoved into one giant block. So you can see how the way that the document is arranged is setting up this rhythm. It's not only showing you what to expect for the rest of the document, what kind of continuity to see, but it's also playing into the conventions that you're already familiar with. You fall into those rhythms because you already know them and you feel comfortable, and it encourages you to continue reading and to feel confident about your absorption of the information. Okay, so I want to look at some different levels of arrangement here. So there's arrangement at the document level, right? So we're looking at where the different sections are, for example. You got your sections numbered, right? So we've got it broken up into 1, 2, a section about definition, a section about genres, a section about constructing the audience, right? Some appendices at the end, and then references. This is the kind of arrangement that you get with a scholarly article. Okay, so then you want to look at arrangement within each section. Okay, so how is each section arranged? Okay, so each section is broken up into a bunch of prose paragraphs, and they are all written in columns. These prose paragraphs, probably anywhere from, let me see, 10 to 15 sentences, it looks like. Okay, and we've got block quotes within those. And none of these paragraphs run a whole page. Some of them are fairly long, but not so long that you can't see the boundaries of them, which helps you to be more confident about reading them. Okay, so then you have organization within the paragraphs. And this is where you start asking yourself, how does the author set up each one of the paragraphs? A common way to think about this is you often have a topic sentence in a paragraph, right? So a person will make a claim, and then they will start maybe qualifying that claim, maybe defining something, or just launch straight into their evidence, right? Showing you why the thing that they just said is true. And often you have a closing sentence at the end of that paragraph that either links you with the next paragraph, or maybe, and it could still be linking you with the next paragraph, but it would also confirm the statement that was made at the beginning of that paragraph in the introductory claim. And then you have arrangement at the sentence level. And granted, lots of different authors use lots of different styles with their sentences. Some sentences are a lot longer, some sentences are a lot shorter, some sentences have a lot more punctuation, breaking them up into smaller clauses. Some don't have that at all. Some use a lot of things like semicolons, where they're linking two ideas together instead of separating them into two different sentences. And you can think about this more when you read the music, rhythm, rhetoric article that I'm going to be sharing with you soon. And then beyond that, you have clauses within those sentences. Okay, so let's just think, and there are obviously clauses within clauses. Genre study has been primarily phenomenological and typological in function. And even within these, you have grammatical and syntactic structures that are either appropriate or inappropriate, or maybe intentionally twisting the language in a way that it isn't normally used. And all of these different ways of approaching your audience affect what your audience thinks of you. It affects how they absorb the information, and affects what they think of the content. Okay, so how do these different things affect each other? Well, if you know what genre that you're creating, right, then you might have a pretty good idea of what medium you'll be using. So, for example, 20 years ago, if you were going to write a novel, it would almost certainly be in print. Say you're going to be making a video about how to draw a turkey using your hand. What's the likely audience for this video? Well, there are a couple of different options. You could possibly be doing this for a teacher, or you could possibly be doing this for teachers. You could possibly be doing this for parents. You could possibly be doing it for children. Now, it's pretty easy to mix the teachers and parents group because they have a lot of the same concerns. They are often in the same age group. They don't have the kind of limitations when watching these videos, intellectual limitations, and particular communication needs, right, that children have when they're watching an instructional video. You can go faster with an adult. You can use more formal language with an adult. You don't have to use all kinds of simple diction when you're dealing with an adult. You can put it in a different kind of context with an adult. Like if you're talking to teachers, you can say, this is how you do it in the classroom. And there would be no need for you to say that to a child. Whereas with a child, you might want to use simpler diction. You might want to make the video maybe more entertaining. Your tone is going to be a lot different. How you design your content, what kind of background music you use, right? All this is going to change based on who your audience is. Okay, so say that you are the boss at your company and you need to convey the message to your employees that your company is going green. Okay, so you need to decide first, what is the appropriate way to convey this message? Well, often this message would be conveyed in a memo. So you choose to go ahead and use a memo. Okay, so if you're going to use a memo, Is it going to be print or electronic? What's the medium going to be? So you know the genre. How are you going to present that genre? Well, you have lots of printers in the office, right? You could print off a whole lot of copies of this memo and have it sent out to each of your employees, but that's going to go against the concept of going green, and it's just going to waste paper in general, and it's not even as fast as just sending this out electronically, which you can do from one email, and with one click of a button on the computer, or with one click of the mouse, however you want to think about it. So what kind of tone are you going to use with your employees? Are you going to be flippant? Are you going to be really silly? Are you going to be informal? No, you're probably going to be extremely formal. If you happen to normally be informal with your staff, you may choose to be informal in that situation, but it's generally not appropriate for workplace communication to be informal about anything. There are degrees of formality, right? You can be like less authoritative. If you're not a boss, like if you are speaking to somebody else who is at your same level in the company and has your same level of power in the company, maybe you even have the same job and you're shooting an email saying, hey, I need you to send me these files, or here are the files I'm sending you, here's something that we need to do together. You can be a little less formal than the boss might be in a situation like that, but you certainly don't want to go to complete informality. And so you get the idea. So if you know one element of the rhetorical situation, or even especially multiple elements of the rhetorical situation, you can use those to shape the other elements that you're unsure about going in.